Nobody expected this to happen. When NBC announced their latest basketball analysts, executives thought they had it all figured out. Safe, predictable, another talking head to fill airtime. Then Caitlin Clark walked into Madison Square Garden and destroyed every assumption they'd ever made. Within 60 seconds of going live, something shifted. The energy in the studio changed. Social media platforms started glowing red with activity. Viewership numbers climbed so fast, the network's analytics team thought their systems were malfunctioning. This wasn't supposed to be the story. LeBron James was playing. The Lakers versus Knicks. Prime time. Legacy on the line. But nobody could stop talking about what was happening in the pregame show. February 1st, 2025. The spotlight was supposed to belong to the players on the court. Instead, it belonged to a 22-year-old sitting at a desk surrounded by basketball royalty. Carmelo Anthony, Vince Carter, Tracy McGrady. 3 Hall of Famers with more combined experience than most analysts will ever touch. And then there was Clark. She didn't wait her turn, didn't sit quietly like the newcomer learning from legends. She jumped into the conversation like she'd been doing this for a decade. Breaking down offensive schemes with surgical precision, explaining defensive rotations in ways that made casual fans suddenly understand concepts they'd never grasped. Predicting plays before they happened with an accuracy that made the veterans pause and recalibrate. The Hall of Famers noticed immediately. You could see it in their faces. The slight hesitation before responding. The moment of recognition when they realized this wasn't going according to plan. Clark wasn't playing a supporting role. She was commanding the room. She anticipated questions before they were asked. Corrected assumptions with politeness that somehow made the correction land even harder. Offered insights that didn't just complement what the legends were saying, they expanded on them. This wasn't a publicity stunt. This wasn't NBC checking a diversity box. This was genuine basketball intelligence on display at the highest level. And the audience? They went absolutely nuclear. NBC's internal data started telling a story executives hoped for, but never truly believed would materialize. Viewership didn't gradually increase during her segment. It exploded. The numbers spiked so violently that data analysts triple-checked their equipment looking for errors. Her breakdowns were outperforming the actual game content. Clips of her analysis spread faster than highlight reels from LeBron himself. The Caitlin Clark effect, a phenomenon documented throughout her college career, had just jumped into an entirely new arena. And this time, it wasn't about ticket sales or merchandise. It was about pure, undeniable, impossible to manufacture attention. In the modern media landscape, attention is the only currency that matters, and Clark had just proven she could generate it anywhere, anytime, on any platform. But behind the scenes, not everyone was celebrating. Some were watching with clenched jaws and growing resentment, because what happened at Madison Square Garden that night didn't just prove Clark belonged in mainstream media. It proved something far more dangerous to the established order. And what came next would force the entire basketball world to confront an uncomfortable truth they'd been avoiding for years. If you're enjoying this deep dive into how Caitlin Clark is revolutionizing basketball media, hit that subscribe button for Ball Pool. We break down the stories the mainstream won't tell you. The reaction behind closed doors was immediate and complicated. According to multiple sources who requested anonymity, several prominent WNBA players were watching the broadcast unfold with something far less than enthusiasm. Here's the thing. Their frustration had nothing to do with anything Clark said or did wrong. She was professional, insightful, respectful to everyone on that platform. The problem was what her presence represented. For nearly 3 decades, the WNBA has operated under one specific philosophy: collective growth. Stars weren't supposed to overshadow the league. The rising tide was meant to lift all boats equally. Any player who attracted disproportionate attention was quietly discouraged from standing too far above the crowd. Marketing focused on the sport itself, not individual brilliance. Media coverage emphasized team achievements over personal dominance. The message was crystal clear. Nobody is bigger than the game. Then Caitlin Clark arrived and shattered that entire framework without even trying. She didn't demand special treatment, didn't complain about coverage, didn't push for individual recognition. She just played basketball at a level that made it impossible to look away. And audiences responded by doing something unprecedented in women's professional basketball history. They showed up. Fans bought tickets months in advance, subscribed to streaming platforms just to watch her games, turned the Indiana Fever into appointment television for people who'd never watched a WNBA game in their lives. The collective growth model collapsed under one undeniable truth. People don't fall in love with leagues. They fall in love with players. And Clark had become the most beloved basketball player in America, regardless of gender, regardless of league, regardless of any category the sports world tried to force her into. The NBC broadcast made this reality impossible to ignore. Here was a WNBA player, a woman competing in a league many NBA fans had never seriously engaged with, commanding attention during primetime NBA coverage. She wasn't being treated as a curiosity, not as a special guest, not as a representative of women's basketball. She was being treated as a basketball authority whose insights were valuable, period. The implications were staggering. If Clark could cross over into mainstream sports media as a voice rather than just a story, then the carefully maintained separation between men's and women's professional basketball was suddenly negotiable. And for people who'd built entire careers on that separation, who'd positioned themselves as the proper authorities on the game, that possibility was deeply threatening. The data that emerged in the hours after the broadcast confirmed what viewers sensed in real time. Clark's segment didn't just perform well, it dominated. Social media engagement showed her clips circulating faster than content featuring the actual NBA players scheduled to compete. Comment sections across every platform overflowed with one repeated sentiment: "We want more." Viewers wanted her insight on every major matchup, every pregame analysis, every breakdown she could offer. People tuning in for LeBron James discovered something even more compelling. And NBC executives who'd taken a calculated risk suddenly looked like absolute geniuses. The network already understood her commercial power. During her senior year at Iowa, they'd placed one of her record-breaking games behind a paywall and watched subscriptions surge as casual viewers decided Clark was worth paying to see. That experience taught NBC something critical. She wasn't just a basketball player. She was a conversion engine capable of transforming interest into action. February 1st confirmed this influence extended far beyond her playing career. Her presence alone moved numbers, drove engagement, and captured attention in ways that defied traditional media logic. Critics struggled to accept this reality. They claimed the attention was manufactured, the result of bias or favoritism. But numbers don't negotiate. They don't defer to tradition or hierarchy. Numbers reflect desire. And the numbers were unambiguous. Audiences wanted Caitlin Clark. They still do. And they'll continue to follow her wherever she goes. But here's where the story gets really interesting and really uncomfortable. Because the backlash from certain corners of the basketball world exposed a tension that had been simmering for years. A fundamental disagreement about what women's basketball should be and who should be allowed to represent it. For some players, Clark's elevation to a national platform during NBA coverage felt like validation of something they'd always resented. Why her? The question echoed through social media, podcasts, and private conversations among players who felt they'd worked just as hard without receiving anything close to the same recognition. The answer is uncomfortable because it reveals truths people would prefer to ignore. And what happened next at Madison Square Garden would force everyone to confront the real reason Caitlin Clark commands attention that others simply cannot. Don't miss what happens next. Subscribe to Ball Pool for the stories that challenge everything you think you know about basketball. Caitlin Clark commands attention because she plays basketball in a way that captures imagination. The logo threes that seem to defy the laws of physics. The court vision that finds teammates in positions nobody else even saw. The confidence that reads as arrogance to critics and as pure excellence to fans. She doesn't just win games, she creates moments. Moments that get clipped and shared and watched again and again until they become part of the cultural conversation. This isn't a skill that can be taught or acquired through grinding alone. It's a rare gift that some players possess and most simply don't. The ability to make the game feel like entertainment rather than just competition. And here's the uncomfortable truth that nobody wants to say out loud. This gift doesn't distribute itself fairly. It doesn't care about seniority, doesn't care about how many years someone spent grinding in relative obscurity. It simply exists in some players and not in others. and audiences respond accordingly. The resentment directed at Clark is ultimately resentment directed at this unfairness. But it's easier to believe her success results from media manipulation or corporate favoritism than to accept that some people are simply more captivating than others. That entertainment value is a real, measurable quality some athletes possess in abundance. The players who criticize her coverage aren't wrong to observe the attention is disproportionate. It absolutely is disproportionate. But they're wrong about the source. It doesn't come from networks deciding to favor one player over another. It comes from millions of viewers making independent choices about what they want to watch. And those choices aggregate into something that looks like favoritism, but is actually just democracy in action. The market has spoken. Clark is what people want to see. And no amount of institutional pushback can override that verdict. What made the February 1st broadcast so threatening to the existing order wasn't simply that Clark received attention. WNBA players receive attention all the time. What made this different was the nature of the attention. She wasn't being presented as a women's basketball player appearing on an NBA broadcast. She was being presented as a basketball analyst whose gender and league affiliation were incidental to her expertise. The Hall of Famers beside her didn't treat her with the gentle condescension that often accompanies cross-gender sports discussions. They engaged with her observations seriously, built on her points, occasionally deferred to her perspective when it offered something they hadn't considered. This wasn't tokenism. This wasn't inclusion theater. This was genuine professional respect being extended in real time on national television. The implications extend far beyond one broadcast segment. If Clark can be accepted as a basketball authority during NBA coverage, then the walls between men's and women's professional basketball become far more permeable than anyone previously assumed. Other WNBA players with broadcasting aspirations might find doors opening that were previously closed. The conversation about women in sports media might shift from representation for its own sake to recognition based on genuine expertise. The entire framework that's kept women's basketball in a separate, lesser category might begin to erode. This should be good news for everyone who cares about the growth of women's sports. But for some, it represents a threat rather than an opportunity. Because if the walls come down, the protected spaces disappear too. And some people have built their entire careers within those protected spaces. NBC producer Sam Flood understood exactly what he was doing when he brought Clark on board. In interviews after the announcement, he expressed complete confidence in her ability to handle the position. She's had cameras pointed at her for years, he noted. She always delivers. She's thoughtful. She has the ability to perform on this platform. These weren't the cautious words of an executive hedging bets on a risky hire. These were the confident statements of someone who recognized a generational talent and moved decisively to secure her before competitors could react. Flood saw what the numbers had been screaming for years. Clark isn't just a basketball player. She's a media property of extraordinary value. And anyone smart enough to align with her early will benefit enormously from her inevitable rise. What happened on February 1st cannot be undone. Once a star crosses into mainstream sports media, not as a subject but as a voice, the trajectory becomes irreversible. Clark is no longer simply a WNBA player who generates storylines. She's become a basketball personality with a platform that extends beyond her league, beyond any single broadcast, beyond the game she plays. She's proven she can command attention in any context, that audiences will follow her wherever she appears, that her influence isn't confined to the court. The power dynamics of the sport have shifted, and the ripple effects will take years to fully manifest. Her leverage over networks, sponsors, and even league decisions has grown exponentially. Her ability to shape conversations about basketball is now undeniable. But there's one more chapter to this story, one more move that will determine whether Clark becomes the biggest thing in basketball or something even larger. And it all comes down to what happens on March 29th. Subscribe to Ball Pool right now, because what's coming next will redefine everything you thought you knew about sports media. March 29th looms like a confirmation hearing. The first broadcast was a breakthrough, a moment that proved she belonged on that stage. But the second broadcast, That's the real test. Every word will be scrutinized, every interaction analyzed, every clip dissected by critics desperate to find a crack in the foundation. If she replicates her February impact, the narrative shifts from "does she belong" to "how much will she own?" And that's the scenario that keeps the establishment awake at night. Because once Clark cements her presence in mainstream sports media, she no longer needs permission to remain. She becomes a permanent fixture, a voice that can't be silenced or sidelined. Consider the next 5 years if her current trajectory continues. She dominates the WNBA during playing seasons, drawing audiences that dwarf anything the league has seen before. In the off seasons, she appears regularly on NBA broadcasts, building a media presence that rivals the most successful former players turned analysts. Her signature Nike shoe becomes a bestseller across genders. Her social media following explodes into tens of millions. Her influence spills beyond basketball into broader cultural conversations. She becomes more than an athlete. She becomes a celebrity whose opinions carry weight in ways few sports figures ever achieve. This isn't fantasy. It's the logical extension of current trends. For those invested in the old order, the careful separation between men's and women's basketball, the collective growth strategies designed to limit individual dominance, this scenario is deeply unsettling. The threat isn't personal. Clark clearly cares about the growth of the league and the success of her peers. The threat is structural. Her success exposes the limitations of decades-old strategies. If one player can command more attention than an entire league, then the collective growth model was never truly about growth. It was about control. Clark's rise demonstrates that an alternative is possible, one that embraces star power, that acknowledges fans follow players rather than leagues, that treats professional basketball as entertainment first, philosophy second. Once this path is visible, defending the old model becomes nearly impossible. The basketball world now stands at a crossroads that a single player forced into existence. The decisions made in the coming years will determine whether women's basketball evolves into a league with commercial and cultural clout equal to its potential, or whether it retreats into the comfort of managed expectations. Clark has shown what happens when talent is allowed to shine, when audiences respond freely, when the market dictates value. The question is no longer what's possible. It's whether the institutions will embrace it or resist it. The February 1st takeover was only the opening move. Every broadcast from now on will be measured against it, every ratings report compared, every expectation rewritten. Clark hasn't just entered the conversation, she's changed the rules entirely. NBC didn't create Caitlin Clark. They recognized the phenomenon and positioned themselves to benefit. Now everyone else must adapt, resist and risk irrelevance, embrace and risk losing control. That's the choice facing every network, every league executive, every traditional power broker in basketball media right now. And here's what they're terrified to admit. The choice has already been made for them. Because audiences have voted with their attention, their subscriptions, their engagement, they've decided what they want to see. And what they want is Caitlin Clark. Not as a representative, not as a symbol, not as a token gesture toward inclusivity, but as the most compelling voice in basketball media today. The old guards can complain. They can push back. They can craft narratives about fairness and equity and collective growth. But none of it matters anymore. The tide has turned. The walls are coming down. And the player who broke through first gets to write the rules for everyone who follows. That player is Caitlin Clark. And the story is far from over. In fact, it's just beginning. Because what happened at Madison Square Garden wasn't the peak of her influence. It was the foundation. The question now isn't whether she'll succeed in mainstream media. That's already been answered. The question is, how far will her disruption reach? How many of the old structures, the carefully managed narratives, will survive her rise? And in a world where audiences follow excellence wherever it appears, who will adapt and who will be left behind? One thing is certain, the basketball world will never be the same. And anyone who doubted that Caitlin Clark could command any room, any platform, any stage she steps onto, they're not doubting anymore. That's the full story, but we're just getting started at Ball Pool. Subscribe now because the next chapter of the Caitlin Clark revolution is about to unfold, and you won't want to miss a single moment.